We're going to look at the problem involved when you're given a particular sine and you're supposed to find angles between 0 and 360 that have that sine value. The first thing you want to do is get the sine inverse of that value, and that will give you that particular angle. Now, when I gave the introduction to trigonometry in a coordinate system, I talked about the bow tie, and you see in this case this 50 degree could be any one of these four angles that I've marked with a dot. Since the sine is positive, the two possible angles are either in this quadrant, where all trig ratios are positive, or this one, where the sine is positive. So your two possible answers are the 50, which is here, or 180 minus 50, which is in the second quadrant, or 130 degrees. Now, this time we've been given a cosine which is negative. When I find the inverse, I don't bother with the negative, and the reason for that is if I take the cosine inverse of the positive decimal, I'll get the angle, once again, in the bow tie. Now I look at the negative and say, okay, if the cos is negative, I'm not in this quadrant and I'm not in this quadrant, so I must be here or here. So my answers are 180 minus 25 or 180 plus 25. And that gives me my two possible answers. I'll give you a further example with the tan. Again, I gave you a negative value for tan. Once again, I ignore the negative value when I'm calculating the angle. I do that on my calculator. Once again, the 35 degrees is one of these. Any of these are 35 degrees in size. Since the tan is negative, my answers are not in this quadrant and they're not in that quadrant. So if we're up here, the one answer is 180 minus 35. And if we're down here, we're 360 minus 35. And I've got that worked out here. Here's the 180 minus 35, which puts you in quadrant 2, and 360 minus 35, which puts you in quadrant 4, where the tan is negative. For those of you working in radian measure, here's my second example again, where the cos is negative, and we're working between 0 and 2 pi, the same as 0 and 360 degrees. Once again, I don't bother with the negative sign when I'm doing the inverse. This gives me this many radians. And again, the dots indicate the angles that are all that size in radian measure. And once again, if the cos is negative, we're not in this quadrant and we're not in that quadrant. We have to be in quadrant 2 or quadrant 3. So instead of 180 minus and 180 plus, it's simply pi, which is pi radians to there, minus 0.4363, or pi radians plus 0.4363. So I think the important thing here is when you're doing the inverse, don't bother with the negative, just to find the angle that fits inside the bow tie, and then use your cast rule to figure out which quadrant your answers lie.